She served their tables in silence for 3 days. The morning she left, she took everything with her. Before we begin, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you started this story. Tonight's story is one you will carry with you long after it ends. Part 1. The Name Above All Names. There are families in England whose names open doors that money alone cannot unlock. The Ravensworth Name was such a name. For 3 centuries, the Dukes and Duchesses of Ravensworth had shaped the quiet corners of English life. They had lent their land to tenant farmers, who worked it faithfully across generations. They had built schools in villages that would otherwise have none. They had carried themselves through triumph and ruin with the same composed dignity, never louder in prosperity than they were in grief, never smaller in difficulty than they had been at the height of their power. The current Duchess, Elspeth Ravensworth, was 62 years old. She had silver hair arranged with quiet precision, and eyes the pale gray of winter mornings that seemed to see everything without ever appearing to look at anything in particular. Since the death of her husband, the late Duke, 8 years past, she had managed the Ravensworth affairs alone, the estates, the tenant agreements, the charitable endowments, and the careful alliances that kept a great family standing in a changing world. She did all of it without complaint and without the need for anyone's approval. Ravensworth Park sat deep in the Yorkshire countryside behind iron gates flanked by old stone falcons, the family's symbol. Its corridors were wide and warm. Its kitchens were never cold. Its servants stayed for decades because they were treated as people rather than furniture. Visitors often remarked that it felt less like a formal estate and more like a house that genuinely understood what a home was meant to be. Elspeth's greatest devotion, her only living softness, was her son. Lord James Ravensworth was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and quietly steady in the way of men who do not need to fill a room with noise to be noticed in it. He had his father's easy manner with strangers and his mother's precision with words. He was not brilliantly clever or dramatically handsome. He was honest. He was patient. He listened when others spoke. He remembered names. In a world that increasingly rewarded spectacle, James Ravensworth was the kind of man who made people feel, without quite knowing why, that things would probably be all right. He had always said he would marry for something real. Then he met Miss Vivienne Calder. She arrived in Yorkshire society during the summer racing season, moving through garden parties and charity luncheons with the practiced ease of a woman who had studied every room before she entered it. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged. Her gown spoke of money without appearing to shout about it. She laughed at precisely the right moments and listened with the attentive expression of someone who found every word spoken to her genuinely fascinating. Within weeks, James was lost. He brought flowers to Calder House on Tuesday mornings. He rode beside her carriage in Hyde Park on visits south. He spoke of her at his mother's dinner table with a softness in his voice that Elspeth had never heard from him before. Not about a horse, not about a piece of land, not about anything. Society celebrated the romance as though it were already a wedding. Only Elspeth remained unconvinced. She noticed things. She had always noticed things. She noticed that Vivienne never thanked a servant unless someone of consequence was nearby to hear it. She noticed that her warm attention cooled noticeably when speaking with anyone she judged beneath her ambitions. She noticed how carefully and how often Vivienne mentioned the Ravensworth jewels in conversation, not with greed exactly, but with the proprietary interests of a woman already thinking of them as hers. When Elspeth raised her concerns gently, James smiled the particular smile of a young man who believes his mother is afraid of losing him. "You have never trusted anyone I have cared for," he said one evening. "I have trusted everyone you cared for," she replied. "I have not trusted the ones who cared primarily for what you carry." He kissed her cheek, picked up his gloves, and went to meet Vivienne. That night, Alone in the library with the fire burning low and her husband's portrait watching from the wall, Elspeth sat for a long time thinking about love and blindness and the particular cruelty of beautiful lies told to kind people. By morning, her decision was made. She would go herself. Not as a duchess. Not as a woman whose family crest appeared above the entrance of 3 separate estates, but as someone the Calders would never think to study. Part 2. The woman no one would notice. Elspeth's chief steward was a man named Pemberton, who had served the Ravensworth household for 29 years and possessed the invaluable quality of never appearing surprised by anything his employer decided. She told him what she intended. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, carefully, with the economy of a man who has learned that the Duchess is usually right, and began making arrangements. Through a domestic placement agency in Leeds, a position was quietly requested at Calder Manor, not a housekeeper or lady's companion, nothing that would attract attention or require letters of introduction. A temporary kitchen assistant to help with preparations for the Calder Midsummer House party. The party at which James had been invited. The party at which, Elspeth had learned through careful inquiry, an informal engagement announcement was being planned. From the back of her wardrobe, she retrieved clothing she had not touched in years, garments kept for charitable visits to mission kitchens and hospital wards. A plain dark dress without any decoration. A practical apron much washed. Sturdy shoes. A linen cap designed to conceal silver hair. She removed her rings slowly and with care. The sapphire her husband had placed on her finger the morning after their wedding. Her grandmother's pearl ring, 5 generations old. The Ravenswood signet, worn so long she sometimes forgot it was there. She placed each one in a velvet-lined case and pressed the lid closed. She stood for a moment before the long mirror in her dressing room. The Duchess of Ravensworth had disappeared. In her place stood a woman that no one at Calder Manor would think twice about. Pemberton was waiting at the carriage with his hat in his hands. His expression, usually perfectly controlled, moved briefly in a way she recognized as concern. "Your Grace," he began. "Wait," she said simply, "until I send for you. Then come quickly." Calder Manor occupied pleasant country in the lower valley, 2 hours' drive south. It was a handsome house, newly renovated with the lavish and slightly aggressive confidence of money that has recently arrived and wants to make certain everyone is aware of it. New stonework gleamed too brightly on the south face. The ornamental garden was filled with flowers arranged for the impression of abundance rather than the pleasure of walking among them. The gilded entrance gates shone like an announcement. It was a beautiful house trying very hard to look as though it had always been there. Elspeth arrived at the servants' entrance with a modest bag and her cap straight. A footman looked her over without slowing his step. "Agency woman?" "Yes," she said. "Kitchen. End of the corridor. Don't block doorways." She walked inside without another word. Part 3. What the kitchen sees. The Calder kitchen was loud, hot, and organized entirely around anxiety. For the house party, for extra helpers had been engaged, and they moved around each other in the warm, narrow space with the careful efficiency of people who understood that mistakes here carried consequences that traveled upstairs very rapidly. The head cook, Mrs. Greer, was a compact woman with flour on her sleeves and a voice that functioned as its own timetable. She assigned Elspeth to the washing station with the distracted authority of someone too busy to spare attention on a new face, handed her a heavy apron, and returned to her pastry without another glance. Elspeth washed. She carried. She sorted silver. She kept her eyes and her ears open. The other kitchen staff were kind in the way that exhausted people are kind, briefly, practically, without expectation of return. A young maid named Molly, perhaps 17, with freckled cheeks and a habit of humming softly to herself, found Elspeth the correct shelves without being asked and quietly explained which of the bells from upstairs required immediate response and which ones could be allowed a moment's grace. Mrs. Calder rings properly when she is satisfied, Molly murmured while sorting napkins. When she is not satisfied, she doesn't bother with the bell at all. She simply appears in the room. Elspeth nodded and understood. By the end of the second day, she had seen what she had come to see. Mrs. Eugenia Calder moved through her house with the loud self-assurance of a woman who had decided that spending considerable money was essentially the same thing as earning considerable respect. She walked too fast, corrected too publicly, and pointed at imperfections in flower arrangements and table settings with a bright, proprietorial pleasure in finding them wrong. The maids avoided her path. The footmen perfected the art of appearing occupied the precise moment she entered a room. Vivienne in private was a different creature entirely from Vivienne on James's arm. Without the warmth she performed for James, she was efficient and precise in a way that left no warmth in the air around her. She gave orders without courtesies. She noticed faults in presentations and in people with the sharp, focused eyes of someone who enjoyed the noticing. She had a particular way with younger maids, never raising her voice in a manner that could be called unkind by anyone who had not felt it, but low and exact and careful in a way that left marks that no one could point to. "That cap is crooked," she said to one girl without slowing her step down the corridor. "I cannot look at it." The girl adjusted the cap with shaking hands, her face held completely still. On the afternoon of the second day, carrying a tray of prepared pastries through the service corridor toward the upper drawing room, Elspeth passed a door left open by half an inch and heard a conversation that made her stop completely. Vivienne's voice. And a man's voice, low and familiar in a way that did not sound like a new acquaintance. "He suspects nothing," Vivienne said. "He is entirely content." "And when you are married?" the man said. A pause. When Vivienne answered, there was amusement in it that she did not bother to conceal. "When I am married, the situation becomes simpler for both of us. Ravensworth Park requires new management. The present arrangement is old-fashioned and sentimental. James is generous and will be guided." "And the Duchess?" Vivienne's reply was immediate and light. "Old women are only dangerous when they have allies and energy. She will have less of both once we are settled. The east wing of the park is pleasant and very quiet, and quite far from the main rooms." The man laughed softly. Then Vivienne's voice again, lower but still clearly audible through the half-open door. "One does not take a house by force, Aldous. One simply makes oneself indispensable until being removed becomes too inconvenient to arrange." Aldous. Elspeth noted the name carefully. She noted the familiar ease with which it was used. She noted everything else the exchange contained: the planning, the patience, the complete absence of anything resembling genuine feeling for the man Vivienne intended to marry. She moved away from the door quietly, the pastry tray perfectly steady in her hands. That evening she wrote 4 words to Pemberton on a plain sheet of paper. "Tomorrow. Bring the cars." Part 4. The mark on her cheek. The morning of the third day came warm and bright, carrying with it the sound of arriving carriages and the high tension of a household preparing to perform for its guests. Elspeth was given fresh linen to carry to the upper guest rooms. She moved in the quiet, unhurried manner she had practiced for 3 days, unremarkable, unnoticed, indistinguishable from every other woman in a plain dark dress moving through the upper corridors of Calder Manor. She was passing the main staircase when Vivienne descended. She was dressed for the afternoon in pale blue silk with white gloves and pearl drops at her ears, every detail precisely correct. Behind her came 2 maids with hat boxes. Below in the entrance hall, a small group of guests had recently arrived and stood in pleasant conversation. Vivienne's face wore the warm, gracious expression she reserved for moments she expected to be observed. Elspeth stepped close to the wall to allow passage. Vivienne swept past without reducing her pace. The edge of Vivienne's wide skirt caught the edge of the linen stack in Elspeth's arms. A single pillowcase slid from the top and fell to the corridor floor. It touched the hem of Vivienne's gown. For the smallest fraction of a second, Vivienne stopped. She turned. The guests below paused their conversation. The two maids with hat boxes went completely still. "You clumsy creature!" Vivienne's voice was quiet and controlled and entirely without warmth. "Do you know what this gown cost? Do you have any idea at all?" "I am sorry," Elspeth said, her voice soft and level. "It was an accident." "An accident," Vivienne repeated, as though the word were something she found amusing in a tired way. Then her hand moved. The slap struck Elspeth's cheek sharply enough that the sound carried down the staircase. A maid behind Vivienne drew a sudden breath. One of the hatbox girls closed her eyes. Elspeth did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not step backward. She simply stood, absorbed the blow, and then raised her eyes to Vivienne's face with an expression so entirely composed, so perfectly quiet, that Vivienne blinked in spite of herself. In Vivienne's experience, a woman who had been struck either wept or apologized. This woman did neither. She simply looked. "Pick it up," Vivienne said after a moment, her voice already returning to its smooth, practiced warmth for the benefit of the guests below. "And please try to be useful." She descended the stairs. Laughter reached upward from the entrance hall as Vivienne greeted her guests with bright, delighted warmth. She touched the arm of a nervous young maid who had been standing near the door since morning. "Poor dear, do rest where you can," she said sweetly. In the corridor above, young Molly crept forward from the service doorway where she had seen everything. Her eyes were very bright. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Elspeth touched the mark on her cheek without changing her expression. "I am perfectly well," she said. Molly looked at her for a long moment, at the stillness of her, the complete absence of fear or shame or anger, with the expression of someone standing near something they do not yet have the words for. "What will you do?" Molly asked. Elspeth picked up the fallen pillowcase and replaced it carefully on the linen stack. "I will wait," she said, "and then I will be very useful indeed." Part 5. 3 Black Cars. Luncheon was served beneath the garden pergola at 1 o'clock, the long table laid with white linen and crystal and flowers cut from the ornamental garden at morning. 12 guests gathered, neighboring families, 2 acquaintances of Eugenia's from London, and Lord James Ravensworth, who sat beside Vivienne with the relaxed happiness of a man entirely at peace with his afternoon. Staff moved between the tables with bread baskets, silver tureens, platters of cold salmon and dressed cucumber, and chilled lemonade. Among them, carrying a wine jug and wearing a plain dark dress, was Elspeth. She poured for a retired colonel who did not look at her. She cleared a plate for an elderly widow who thanked her with distracted courtesy. She moved between Vivienne and James without once being recognized by either. James laughed at something Vivienne said. Vivienne rested her gloved hand on his arm. Elspeth moved to the far end of the table and set the wine jug down. From beyond the garden wall, carried on the early afternoon air, came a sound. Engines. Not one. Several. And growing. The sound moved from a low hum to a deep and powerful presence that drew every conversation under the pergola to silence, and every eye toward the gravel drive visible through the garden's iron gate. 3 motor cars swept through the entrance in perfect single file. Their black panels shone in the afternoon sun with a kind of polish that requires daily attention. On each door, set in silver with precise workmanship, was a crest that every family in Yorkshire recognized. The Ravensworth falcon. Eugenia called a rose from her chair so quickly it scraped across the stone patio. She straightened her necklace and pressed both hands flat against the front of her gown, assembling her expression into something between dignity and triumph. The Ravensworth household had come, in full ceremony, to honor the approaching engagement. She turned to Vivienne with a broad, bright smile. Vivienne touched her pearls and smoothed the front of her gown. She took James's arm possessively. "How thoughtful of your mother," she said sweetly. James said nothing. He was frowning. He had not been told his household was coming. From the 3 cars descended staff in formal Ravensworth livery, a household secretary, senior footmen, and finally Mr. Pemberton, the chief steward, tall and silver-haired, who walked across the garden toward the pergola at a pace that somehow moved all other sound and motion to one side, without appearing to hurry. Eugenia stepped forward with her hand extended and her brightest smile. "Mr. Pemberton, what an extraordinary—" He walked past her, as though she were a garden ornament. Vivienne stiffened. Pemberton continued across the white linen shadow of the pergola, past the colonel, past the London guests, past James, who was standing now, past Vivienne, who had taken one step forward and stopped. He stopped before the plainly dressed woman standing with a wine jug at the far end of the table. He bowed, a deep, formal, complete bow, the kind given to one person and one person only in the entire Ravensworth household. His voice was clear and carried across the entire silent garden. "Your Grace." The afternoon stopped. No guest moved. No servant moved. No bird called. The wisteria above the pergola swayed in a gentle breeze that seemed to belong to a different and simpler world. Then the plainly dressed woman set the wine jug down with steady hands. She raised both hands to her head and removed the plain linen cap. Beneath it, silver hair arranged with quiet elegance caught the afternoon light. She stood fully upright. Her posture shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, simply finally. The kitchen woman was gone. Duchess Elspeth Ravensworth stood in her place. Several servants dropped immediately to their knees. One maid began to cry openly. Another pressed herself against the garden wall with both hands over her mouth. Eugenia Calder gripped the back of a chair so hard her knuckles whitened. Vivienne stumbled backward until the legs of her chair caught her. Her lips parted. Nothing came. James looked at the woman he had not recognized for 3 days. At her plain dark dress. At her steady hands. At the fading red mark still visible on her cheek. And whatever warmth had been in his face through the entire long afternoon simply left it. Elspeth raised one gloved hand and touched the mark at her cheek gently. "Your daughter," she said, her voice perfectly calm, "strikes with a very strong arm." Part 6. The truth stands still. Not one person beneath the pergola moved for a long moment. The smell of white roses and cold salmon drifted between what the afternoon had been and what it had now become. Somewhere at the garden's edge a fountain continued running, entirely indifferent. Elspeth did not raise her voice. She had never found it necessary. "I will speak plainly," she said, "because plain speaking saves everyone considerable discomfort." She turned to the assembled staff standing at their stations near the serving tables. "Every person here who witnessed any part of the past 3 days, speak now if you wish. You answer to no one in this household. You answer to me." There was a moment of held breath. Then the footman who had been in the upper corridor spoke first. He described the slap clearly and without decoration. He said what he had seen and then was quiet. Young Molly stepped forward next. Her voice trembled but did not stop. She described what she had watched across 3 days, the coldness behind closed doors, the precise unkindness with junior maids, the performance of warmth assembled and removed as conveniently as a coat. An older housemaid, pale but resolute, spoke of overhearing Vivienne 2 evenings past in the library, speaking with a man in the familiar tone of a long and private understanding. She identified the man, with some difficulty and evident honesty, as Mr. Aldous Crane of Leeds, a young man who had pursued Vivienne for 2 years before the Calders had raised their sights toward the Ravensworth title. The conversation through the half-open door assembled itself into its proper shape. Vivienne had not ended that arrangement. She had simply elevated her present position and planned to maintain both. James stood very still through all of it with his arms at his sides. He did not look at Vivienne. He looked at the tablecloth, and then at the gravel path, and then at the garden wall, and then at nothing in particular. When the last voice finished, Eugenia Calder stepped forward. Her composure was cracking badly. Her voice was high and uneven. "Your Grace, this is a terrible misunderstanding. My daughter is young. She was nervous. She meant nothing by any of it. She struck a woman across the face in your corridor," Elspeth said, in front of witnesses. "There is no misunderstanding. What there is, Mrs. Calder, is a very clear picture. You mistook the absence of visible rank for the absence of consequence. That is an error that tends to carry its own correction." Vivienne came forward then. The tears she produced were real enough, though they arrived too late for belief. "James," she said. Her voice was very low. "James, please, I can explain. I was nervous. I was frightened. I did not mean—" He turned and looked at her for the first time since Pemberton had bowed. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment with the expression of a man seeing something very clearly for the first time and understanding that he cannot unsee it. "No," he said simply, not harshly, only with the permanent finality of a door closing on a room one will not return to. "No." He turned to his mother. He looked at the mark on her cheek. He looked at her plain dark dress, and her ordinary shoes, and her unadorned hands. He looked at the woman who had raised him, who had managed a great estate alone for 8 years, who had come here in servant's clothing, and been struck, and said nothing, and waited because she loved him too much to take his choice away from him by force. His breathing was not steady. "I did not recognize you," he said. 3 days. You were 2 steps from me at luncheon." "I did not." "You were not looking," Elspeth said quietly. "That is a different thing from not seeing." He bowed his head. Part 7. What is owed? Elspeth's final words at Calder Manor were brief, clear, and without cruelty. The arrangement between Lord James Ravensworth and Miss Vivienne Calder was ended, with immediate effect. The invitations that Calder Manor had issued for an upcoming engagement celebration were no longer relevant. The Ravensworth household would communicate this fact through the appropriate channels without elaboration. The renovation of Calder Manor had been financed in significant part through loans extended at favorable terms by an investment house, in which the Ravensworth estate held a controlling interest. Those loans would now be reviewed and managed according to their original contract terms, without exception or extension. Any servant at Calder Manor who wished to seek a new position should submit their name to Pemberton before the cars departed. References from the Ravensworth household would be written personally by the Duchess. When the 3 black motor cars swept back through the iron gates, the garden table beneath the pergola stood largely empty. The Colonel had found urgent business elsewhere. The London guests had remembered prior engagements. The neighboring families departed with the careful speed of people who understood which side of a story to stand on before the story spread without them. It did not take long to spread. Within days, correspondents had moved through drawing rooms from Yorkshire South to London, not through newspaper columns, but through the quieter and far more lasting channel of personal letters from families whose word required no embellishment. The story was told plainly. It was believed completely. Vivienne Calder became a name spoken in drawing rooms with a particular careful pause. Mr. Aldous Crane of Leeds withdrew from her acquaintance with the efficient speed of a man with his own reputation to consider. Invitations ceased. The season engagements Eugenia had so carefully constructed dissolved one by one. Calder Manor, its renovation financed by loans now called and according to their contracts, entered a period of difficulty from which it did not recover gracefully. Its gilded gates and 2 bright stonework were catalogued and valued. Eugenia Calder departed through the servants' entrance she had once reserved for deliveries. She did not look back at the house. Part 8. What Remains. James did not return immediately to Ravensworth Park. He went north instead, to the tenant farms in the upper valley where the spring work had fallen behind and the drainage on the lower fields had not been properly addressed for 2 seasons. He went without servants and without announcement. He worked among the men his father had known, learning their names and the particular needs of their land. He inspected conditions that should have been inspected years ago. He carried himself with the quiet and genuine humility of a man who has received a lesson he will not be allowed to forget and does not ask to. When he returned to the park 3 weeks later, he was quieter and older and more careful than he had been. He took up the estate accounts under his mother's oversight. He attended the tenants' quarterly meeting for the first time in 4 years. He visited the village school his mother had funded for a decade, arriving without ceremony, carrying books, staying for the afternoon. He began learning the names of the gardeners and the stable boys and the kitchen staff he had previously walked past without pause. Pride left him slowly. It left him completely. Autumn arrived early to Yorkshire that year, turning the long beech avenue at Ravensworth Park deep gold and amber. On a cold October morning, Elspeth walked in the walled garden with Molly, the young freckled maid who had stood trembling in Calder Manor's corridor and who now held a respectable position at Ravensworth Park, with lessons in reading, correspondence, and household management arranged by the Duchess herself. They walked for a time in comfortable silence. "Your Grace," Molly said at last, with the careful manner of someone who has been carrying a question a long time. "That morning, in the corridor, when you said you would wait." She hesitated. "How were you not afraid?" Elspeth considered it properly. "Because I knew something they did not," she said. Molly waited. "That patience, properly used," said Elspeth, "is not a form of weakness. It is the sharpest instrument I own." Molly smiled at that. It was the smile of someone who is going to remember a sentence for a very long time. Beyond the garden wall, on the long gravel path leading toward the Easter orchard, James walked beside a young woman Elspeth did not know. She was plainly dressed and carried a leather case of books, the new teacher appointed to the village school. James was pointing toward the orchard and explaining something. She was listening with genuine attention and making a small note in the margin of a page. She was not performing anything. Elspeth watched them for a moment without speaking. Then she turned back to the garden path and the pale autumn light and the quiet future that was already, carefully beginning. Pride, she had always believed, was only borrowed. But character was the one thing that stayed. If this story moved you, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Tell us in the comments, did James deserve his second chance? And did the Duchess do the right thing? Let us know where you are watching from and what time you finished this story. Until next time, remember, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most powerful one in it.